I hate eating, and I despise the fact that human beings have to consume food every day to survive. I have an incredibly high metabolism, and I feel like every time I'm right in the middle of doing something that I actually enjoy, I have to stop to consume food. And eating seems to take up all of my time. I waste half of my day eating. And maybe because of my high metabolism, when I'm hungry, I become so fucking stressed out and angry at everyone and everything, and I can barely function until I get the stupid fucking food inside of me. Anyway, it's safe to say that I am an eat-to-live person and not a live-to-eat person. My other problem with food is that it all has too much flavor. One of my favorite things to do these days is to get takeout from a restaurant and bring it home and cut it with 50% white rice, so it has half as much flavor as before. If all food had 50% less flavor, I would be much happier. Also, if I drink soda water, I like to cut it with 50% tap water. Even unflavored soda water, too flavorful for me. I grew up so deep in the country that there were no restaurants in the town where I'm from. So my food options were my parents' cooking and public school lunch. Now, my parents aren't much better at cooking than I am. But I thought the public school lunch was fine, and I would have been happy eating that for the rest of my life. In college, I had a meal plan, so I ate in the cafeteria every day for every meal. Part of my scholarship required that I live in the dorms, and if you lived in the dorms, you were required to pay for a meal plan. So the meal plan was one of the main things that my parents were paying for in order for me to go to college. So I saw no reason to waste money eating anywhere else. Occasionally, some friends would convince me to go out to a restaurant, and I would join them, and I would not get anything. I would just sit there and watch them eat, and then I would eat my dinner when I got back to the dorms. So this story I'm telling you is about what happened after college. I was living with some friends in Boston, I could not cook, and I was now finally on my own when it came to food. So I went to the grocery store, and I walked the aisles. I'm a practical man, and I'm a frugal man, and what I realized on that day was a 16-ounce can of Stop and Shop brand soup was $1.06 after tax. Now, 4 cans of soup kept me full for an entire day, so for $4.24 a day, I would not be hungry. So I just started buying soup. Now, I was vegetarian at the time, so I mostly ate cans of lentil and minestrone. And I figured these cans, they had beans in there, and vegetables and noodles, and from what I saw, they seemed to have something from every food group. So I filled our pantry with soup, and I just focused on eating canned soup for every meal every day. Obviously, my roommates thought this was weird, and we were in Boston, where the only way people know how to communicate is by making fun of each other, so they ragged on me constantly. But I didn't give a shit. My food problem, it was solved. Now, I did not understand that canned soup was pre-cooked. And if someone had explained this to me, I absolutely would have eaten each meal straight out of the can. But anyway, my cooking method wasn't much better. I would put the soup in a pot on the stove, turn on the stove, and then leave the room for a random amount of time. I'd come back when the pot was boiling, turn off the stove, and move the metal pot full of soup into the freezer of our refrigerator. I'd leave it in the freezer for, once again, for an undetermined amount of time, and I'd come back when the soup was somewhere around room temperature. I would then remove the soup from the freezer and eat it straight from the pot. And I did this 4 times a day, every day, for about 2 years. I love that there's barely any chewing involved with soup. I could just gulp it down and get back to what I was doing. And basically, this was going amazing. I believe I could have gone on eating soup forever. But then I started feeling a little weird. At first, I would get dizzy occasionally when I stood up, sometimes when I urinated. I started having these like little white dots that would zip around in my vision if I rubbed my eyes. And then, as time went on, my heart started racing randomly throughout the day. So, eventually, I went to a doctor. "You have really high blood pressure," they told me. "We're going to do some tests." But the doctors were confused because I was crazy skinny, 25 years old, vegetarian, and I was very physically active at the time. So, after they took blood and everything, they finally asked me what I ate. And I was like, "Yeah, I only eat 4 cans of soup a day. Beans and vegetables and noodles and all the food groups are in there, doc." And after I explained to them just how long this soup thing had been going on, they were like, "Jesus Christ, do you know how much sodium is in that?" And I had no clue what sodium was. I didn't even know it had anything to do with salt. And, of course, the doctors told me no more soup, and they put me on high blood pressure medicine for 2 months, and then my body went back to normal. But I'll tell you, when I think back on those soup years, that 2-year period, it was probably the happiest food years of my life. One year for spring break, my friend Zane and I rode a Greyhound bus 24 hours from Boston to Chicago, which wasn't a perfect plan because our school's spring break was in February, and Chicago is extremely cold in February. But anyway, Zane had some friends who lived there, and they introduced us to some other friends, and soon we were going to bars and house parties, and not letting the cold get us down, and it turned into a great trip. And I met over a dozen people while we were there. But the one person I left thinking about the most was a girl named Barb. Barb worked at a coffee shop in Wicker Park. She had a bob haircut and horn-rimmed glasses, which at that time in my life I thought was the perfect look. And she was funny and kind of awkward, and her name was Barb. How can you not love the name Barb? I just liked saying it. So anyway, Zane and I rode the Greyhound bus 24 hours back to our school, and while I was sleeping on that bus, I was dreaming about Barb. So a year and a half went by, and me and my friend Kyle Thomas started a garage rock band named The Curl. We recorded a record and decided to go on a U.S. tour, but we didn't really know how to do that. Instead of booking the tour in advance, like a normal band, we decided to just get in my car and drive to cities where we knew someone who lived there. And we'd stay in that city, crashing on the friend's couch until we found a show to play. And in some places, this took a couple of weeks, which it was kind of a crazy plan, but it did work, technically. Anyway, we had just finished playing at an anarchist bookstore in Bloomington, Indiana, so we got in my car and started driving to our next destination, which was Chicago. And, okay, so in Bloomington, we had a friend who was part of the art community, and she knew people, and, we went there confident that she could find us a show. But in Chicago, we had one friend, a guy from our hometown who he'd never been involved in any music scene, and he had just moved to Chicago, didn't know anyone, and the chances of him finding us a show seemed very unlikely. But on the 4-hour drive to Chicago, just to make Kyle feel better, I guess, I kept going, "Don't worry, man. Wait till you meet my friend Barb. Barb is going to get us a show. Once Barb is on it, all of our troubles are over. Barb is incredible." And I was just saying Barb this and Barb that, and I didn't really think Barb was going to help us. In reality, this was someone I hardly knew. But it was just something to say while I was driving. And, of course, I just like saying the name Barb. Who doesn't want to say the name Barb? So we got to our friend's apartment, and of course, he didn't know what to do. So I was like, Kyle, we're driving to Wicker Park. We're finding Barb. And soon, we're walking up to the coffee shop where Barb worked the last time I was there. But that was a year and a half earlier. Like, what were the chances that Barb still worked there? And if she did still work there, what were the chances that she was working on that day at the moment that we arrived? It seemed pretty unlikely. But as we were walking up, I'm still going, just wait till you meet Barb. Barb is our Lord and Savior. And we walked into the coffee shop, and I looked behind the counter, and it was fucking Barb back there. Barb herself was behind the register. And suddenly, I am panicking. Because as much as I love saying the name Barb, I did not think there was a chance in hell that she would remember me. Like, I didn't think I had made much of an impression a year and a half earlier. And I didn't want to have to ask a stranger if they could, get my band a show. And it was going to be extra embarrassing for her not to remember me right in front of Kyle, who, I'd just been talking about this woman to him for 6 hours. And suddenly, I was so nervous, I just wanted to leave. I did not want to see Barb. And so I didn't tell Kyle it was her behind the counter. And, my mouth got dry, and we got in line, and I was sweating. And then Kyle asked Barb for a cup of coffee. And Barb turned to me, and she said, "Hey, I met you before." And I was like, "Oh, huh, really?" And she's like, "Yeah, you're from Boston. You're Fletcher, right?" And I went, "Yeah." And she goes, "Yeah, I met you a year ago. I'm Barb." And I was like, "Oh, hey, nice to meet you." And she introduced herself to Kyle, and she asked us what we were doing. And I kind of explained it to her, our whole weird tour idea. And she was like, "My friend runs an open mic tonight. Come back in an hour when I get off work. I'll walk you over there." And I was stunned. And I thanked her. And then Kyle and I left the coffee shop, walked a block away before Kyle turned to me and asked, "What the fuck was that? Why did you pretend you didn't know Barb? What's wrong with you?" And I didn't know. I mean, I guess I was trying to be cool, or I was nervous, or some combination of the two. I definitely had not practiced in my head a conversation where Barb remembered who I was. After all that talk, I was totally unprepared. I honestly didn't even think about what I had done until after Kyle pointed it out. But you know what? Somehow, in the end, the thing I was just joking about all day ended up being exactly true. We went to Chicago, we found Barb, and Barb found us a show. And not only that, Barb found us a place to play faster than anyone else on this entire trip. 1 hour! She was our hero. So we played that open mic, which was about as good as we were going to find in Chicago. And we said goodbye to Barb, and we went back to our friend's place, and we went to sleep. And the next day, we got in my car, and we drove to Minneapolis, where eventually we played at a gay pride parade. I've never punched anyone. I've never personally been involved in a physical confrontation that required punching from me. From time to time, I've had to grab a drunk guy by the shoulders and guide them out of one of the bars I've worked at, but that's about as physical as I've ever gotten, with one exception. There was a couple-year period where I got dinner most nights at a taco truck in Williamsburg. I'd go there around 10 p.m. and then carry the tacos to my favorite stoop, the stoop where I loitered regularly, and I'd eat the tacos sitting on the stoop. Now, the night of the confrontation was a Tuesday in the middle of winter. It was cold, streets were empty, at least for New York standards, and when I arrived at the truck, there were only two people standing there. A young woman who had already ordered and was waiting for her tacos to come out, and a drunk Polish man who was staring at her. If you lived in North Brooklyn at this time, you would be familiar with the Polish drunks who were around. They can basically have the appearance of homeless people, although from what I understand, most of them have homes in Greenpoint. But anyway, this man was, in his late 40s. He was much larger than me. I mean, I'm a fairly small person, so this guy was both stronger and taller than me by a long shot. And after I ordered my tacos, I realized that the man was not just staring at the woman, but he was also mumbling as well. He was looking at her and saying things like, "Let me feel your pussy," and "I just want your pussy." He was saying, explicit sexual things that mostly seemed centered around the word pussy for some reason. Now, the man was wasted. He was teetering on his feet. He was slurring, and his English wasn't perfect anyway. But anyway, he's going on endlessly with this lewd stuff. And the woman was just doing a great job of ignoring him. She was not acknowledging his presence at all. So I didn't know what to do. So I just started ignoring him as well. I guess the one thing I did to help the woman was position myself so I was between the two of them. And the man didn't move, and he didn't stop talking. So now it was kind of like he was saying all this stuff to me, because he was pointed directly at me. Anyway, the tacos at this truck always took a solid 10 minutes to cook. So we were stuck there listening to the drunk guy. And I felt terrible for this woman, and I'm getting angrier at the guy. And he's saying, "Your pussy is so nice. Let me touch it." And his words are I'm turned sideways, so his words are going directly into my ear. And he's saying, "I need my hand inside your pussy." And finally, I just couldn't take it. So I turned and faced the guy, and he's still talking. And now I'm staring directly into his mouth. I'm looking at the source of the words. And suddenly all I want in the world is the sound of his voice to stop. So I reached my hand out and just slowly inserted it into the man's mouth. I had my fingers pointed straight forward, bunched together, and I just kept shoving them deeper and deeper into the man's mouth, forcing them down his throat as deep as they would go. I don't know how I came up with this solution. But anyway, now the sound had stopped, which was a relief. And strangely, the drunk man had almost no reaction. He didn't step back. He didn't try to remove my hand. And so I just left my hand in there. We were standing on the sidewalk, a small man with his hand deeply inserted into a large man's mouth. If you happened to walk by on that cold night, it was probably the strangest fucking sight you ever seen. But anyway, I don't even know how long that went on, but eventually the guy in the taco truck, the guy cooking the tacos, he called out that my tacos were ready. In fact, both mine and the woman's tacos were ready. So I removed my hand from the drunk guy's mouth, and now my hand was completely covered in saliva. It was drenched in this guy's spit, my whole hand up past my wrist. And I turned to the taco truck. The guy handed me my tacos, And I turned to the woman, and I don't even know for what reason I said this, but I turned to her and I said, "I'm sorry." And then I turned and walked away. There was a 2-year period of my life where I didn't have a home. Every night I would just find a friend or stranger's couch to crash on. And this was by choice, so I only think fondly of these years. Anyway, about half of this time was spent in Boston. And on occasion, my high school friend, Kyle Thomas, he would come to Boston and stay with me, which is to say he would crash wherever I was crashing. Everyone loved Kyle, so it wasn't hard showing up at someone's apartment with him by my side. Well, one cold winter night, Kyle and I were killing time at a coffee shop named Espresso Royale. I don't remember where I was planning on staying that night. I always had a couple of options. But suddenly we found ourselves talking to these 2 girls who went to Boston University, which the school was right across the street from the coffee shop. The girls were named Lydia and Pam, and they were roommates in the BU dorms. Now, they were both attractive, but Lydia in particular was, beautiful. Partly because of her looks. She was tall and blonde with medium-length hair, which I liked. But her beauty largely came out of the fact that she seemed very smart and confident and cocky in a way that immediately made me fall in love with her. But the problem was, she was focusing all of her attention on Kyle, and I was not going to cockblock my friend. But I was jealous. This was a time in my life when I was really working on building my own confidence. I had been very uncomfortable flirting with women when I was younger. In fact, Kyle and I, we both had that in common. We both had that problem. But since moving to Boston, I had made some more confident friends, and I was really trying to manifest a cockiness in myself. Because I'd seen that attitude work for my friends when they were trying to attract women. And now I had it in my head that I was the cocky one and Lydia was the cocky one. So obviously we should be together or something. I don't know. Or I was just jealous of Kyle and looking for something to justify my jealousy. Anyway, Kyle is a whimsical person and a great artist who has a lot of charm, so he was doing fine just being himself. But what Kyle couldn't confidently do, that I was ballsy enough to try, was turn to Lydia and Pam and say, "Hey, we don't have anywhere to sleep tonight. Can we stay in your dorm?" And the girls were like, "Yeah, that sounds good." But this ended up being more complicated than you might think. Pam and Lydia lived on a women's-only floor of the dorms. And while men were allowed to visit, they were not allowed to be there after 11 p.m., and they definitely weren't allowed to spend the night. And you had to be signed in by a security guard to even enter the dorms, so they were kind of keeping track of you. So what the girls proposed was we get someone from another floor, from a co-ed floor, we get them to sign Kyle and I in, and then they said we could just come up to the girls' room. No problem. So Kyle and I packed up our stuff, and we headed out into the cold winter night. Soon the 4 of us were just outside of their dorm building, and we're stopping people and asking them to sign us in. But this is not going well. Everyone has some excuse why they don't want to do it. 10 minutes went by. 15 minutes went by. Now we are all freezing, and it's still just no. But eventually, Pam grabbed someone she knew from one of her classes, and suddenly she's like, "Okay, Fletcher, come with me." And soon I'm in their dorm room. Now, maybe 2 minutes go by before Lydia walks through the door, alone. "Where's Kyle?" we ask. And she says, we couldn't find anyone to swipe him in, so he left." Now, this is years before Kyle or I had a cell phone. So on that night, I basically abandoned my high school friend on the cold streets of Boston. But at the same time, I was like, hell yeah, that takes care of that whole Kyle-Lydia problem. She is now mine. Now, I didn't think Lydia and I were going to have sex or anything. Or I didn't even expect that we would kiss. I was not on that level yet. But during this period of my couch surfing life, I had a couple different women who let me sleep in their beds with them. And we would cuddle. And this was just about my favorite thing to do in the world. But as much as I was trying to project this new confident character, I think most women, and in particular actually confident women like Lydia, they could see right through me. So soon Pam and Lydia were laying like a thin comforter on their dorm room floor for me to sleep on, and saying how they had to go to bed for early classes, and if I had to piss, I had to run up a flight of stairs because obviously there's no men's bathroom on the all-women's floor. And this is really not going how I hoped it would. So I ran upstairs, trying not to get spotted in the hall because it was already after 11 p.m. And I came back, and I went to sleep on the hard floor. And that was that. Now, Boston's not that big of a city. So after that night, I would see Lydia around. And then she actually moved to Brooklyn shortly after me. So I ran into her occasionally for years. And every time I did, the first thing she would ask me was how Kyle was. A guy who she met one night in a coffee shop years earlier. And every time she asked, until the last time I saw her, it always, again, made me jealous. I love drinking alcohol, and I have from the moment I tried it, which was in high school. But the challenge at that time in any drinker's life is, of course, where do you get it? By this time, my parents had both quit drinking, so there was nothing in the house. And I didn't know anyone with an older brother, and none of my friends had fake IDs. So, me and my friends would stand around behind the gas station in the small city of Brattleboro, Vermont, and we'd ask strangers to buy us beer. I had about 10 close friends at this time, and we didn't drink every day or anything. It was mostly centered around the weekends. But getting a stranger to buy beer for 10 people, that presents its own challenge. We lived in a liberal hub of a pretty redneck part of the country, and if you were smart, you were definitely looking to ask a redneck to buy the alcohol. Our go-to drink was a case of 40s, which is a box with 12 40-ounce beers in it. But even after you found someone who said yes to the idea of buying you alcohol, you could easily lose them when you told them you wanted an entire case of 40s. That could intimidate them. Anyway, we'd just keep trying redneck after redneck until we succeeded. So we had one friend whose dad was basically perpetually out of town, and we had one friend whose dad didn't mind if we drank in his trailer, even if he was home. And of course, if anyone else's parents went out of town, we drank at their house. So we had some good spots to drink. And sometimes we just drank in the woods and slept there. Anyway, we were all just learning about drinking during these years. And I remember the whole thing very fondly. Now, because alcohol was so precious during that time, I developed a system where the morning after the party, I would walk around and pour whatever little bit of beer was left in the bottom of everyone's 40s into one bottle, into 140. Everyone's backwash collected together, and I'd save that bottle to drink later. And this worked great. This only failed if I neglected to notice a cigarette butt in the bottom of one of the bottles, which would, of course, taint the whole batch. But anyway, I'd take this backwash 40 home, sneak it into my parents' house, and stash it in the closet of my brother and my shared bedroom, so I could sneak it back out whenever I knew something else was going on. So, like a lot of high schoolers, my brother in my room was absolutely trashed. Clothing and records and instruments and skateboard parts everywhere. My parents didn't hassle us about this mess, which I think that's just the right move. Well, I skateboarded every day during these years. So one Saturday, I made a sandwich, told my mom I was driving to the skate park, and jumped in my car. But just down the road, I remembered that the park I was going to required you to wear a helmet. Now, I didn't have a real helmet because I didn't want one. But I had constructed something that looked like a helmet out of cardboard, duct tape, and spray paint, and wrote "Thrash Till Death" on the front of this thing. And no park ever denied me because of this. Anyway, I turned the car around and cruised back home to grab my cardboard helmet, which was in the mess on the floor of my bedroom. But when I got to my bedroom door, I found my mom on her hands and knees going through my closet. And my immediate thought was, fuck, she knows I have a gross-ass backwash 40-ounce beer hidden in there, and she's trying to fish it out. "What are you doing?" I asked my mom. And she said she had decided to do some spring cleaning. And I didn't know where this was coming from, because like I said, she let us keep our room as messy as we wanted, although the rest of the house was clean. But I guess she had just randomly decided to move some stuff around in our closet that day. I don't know. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. But then again, I didn't have a lot of time to think, because she had already removed a pile of stuff, and I knew the 40 couldn't be far behind. So I said, no, I'll do it. I'll clean the closet. But my mom was like, it's fine. I'm already doing it. And I looked at the closet, which only had a curtain for a door. And I looked at the floor of our room, which you could hardly see under all the crap. I looked at my cardboard helmet with "Thrash Till Death" written on the front of it. And I turned to my mom and said, "Dad needs you downstairs. He told me to come get you." "About what?" my mom asked. "I don't know. He said he needs to see you. Right now," he said. I don't know. I just came up to tell you." So my mom got up, got out of the closet, and walked downstairs. I dived into the closet, grabbed the backwash 40, and rushed it over to the filing cabinet near my bed. And this was the filing cabinet where I already kept my porno magazines. So, God forbid, my mom randomly decided to clean in there. And once this was complete, I then ran out of the house as fast as I could. So my mom could not ask me why my dad had no idea what I was talking about. In fact, I ran out of the house so fast, I didn't even remember to grab the cardboard helmet. So now, instead of going to the skate park, I had to take my car and my sandwich and go skateboard behind the 7-Eleven. But while I was back there, I couldn't help but think that some supernatural presence had randomly brought me back home just in time to stop my mom from finding that beer. Like, the backwash 40 gods were certainly looking out for me on that day. In 2009, I was playing in 2 bands. I was lead guitarist in a country rock band named The Wait, like I'm putting on weight. And I was the singer-songwriter in like a melodic garage rock band named The Midnight Prayers. The Midnight Prayers self-released 2 EPs, which meant we just burnt CDs and printed covers at Kinko's, and we made the albums ourselves to sell at shows. And I knew a lot of people in New York, and the Midnight Prayers had gained a decent following. So when we were releasing our second EP, titled Hat It Up to Here, we threw a record release show at this place, Soundfix, which was a record store / coffee shop that I neglected to mention in my Williamsburg history, but it was cool. It was on Bedford and North 11th Street, and you played in the cafe in the back, and the bands ran the soundboard themselves, and it was casual and not that big of a place. So it was packed for our record release party, and the show was basically a big success. So, of course, after we played, I got blackout drunk. There's been a few stories on this podcast where I blacked out while drinking and something eventful happened. And this is not because I blacked out 3 or 4 times in my life and unfortunately each time ended in disaster. It is because I've blacked out hundreds of times, and fortunately in almost every case I came out fine. Really what I hear from the people around me is that they can't tell the difference between drunk Fletcher and blackout drunk Fletcher. Like there's no switch that flips or anything. I guess the one problem I can really point to is that when I'm blackout drunk, I often become really curious about people's lives. And I'll ask them about their childhood and their life goals and their fears. And then the next time I see that person, I don't remember any of it. Like, on multiple occasions, I have introduced myself to people and they're like, wait, what? We know each other. We talked for like 2 hours the other night. You helped me work through my issues with my stepdad. And I have to be like, sorry. Yeah, stepdads, sure. And I fake it. But I don't really remember anything because when I black out, it's all the way. But anyway, I woke the day after the Midnight Prayers record release show, and the last thing I remembered was being at Soundfix. But I felt confident that we had gotten our band's equipment back to the practice space, and when I'm drunk, I'm still good at taking care of everything. But now, I was laying in my bed, hungover, and I had this nagging sensation that something important had happened after the show. And I felt like my phone was somehow involved, which at that time I still had a flip phone, so my phone couldn't do much. But I checked the text messages, there's nothing important there, and I just started going through my contacts looking for something that I didn't recognize. And eventually I saw the name John with the last name Tiqj. And this seemed strange enough or significant enough that I put the phone to my ear and called the number. "Hey," I said, "this is Fletcher." And a man on the other end of the line was like, "What's up, Fletcher? Great show last night. Are you guys in?" And I didn't know who this was or what he was talking about, but then I asked enough questions to learn that this was John McCauley, the singer of the band Deer Tick, which I knew by name, but I wasn't really familiar with their music at the time. And he told me that in 1 week, Deer Tick had a sold-out show at Bowery Ballroom, and they wanted my other band, The Wait, to open the show because some band had dropped off. And, of course, I was a little disappointed that he didn't want the band that I wrote the songs for, the one that just played the great show the night before. I was secretly a little sad that he didn't want that band to play, but I understood that Deer Tick was in the country rock world, like The Wait, and now I was suddenly getting very excited because I'd always wanted to play Bowery Ballroom. It has been one of the most significant New York venues during my time in the city, and it's big. It holds over 500 people. And Deer Tick didn't even need us to bring anyone because it's already sold out, and they just wanted us to play because they really liked our band, which was great because The Wait we struggled along and we never had that much love. Anyway, obviously, We were in. I guess I should also say that playing Bowery Ballroom gave me an opportunity to make up for the disaster that took place the one other time I had played a large venue. I had joined the Wait 3 years earlier, and at that time I really couldn't play lead guitar. I didn't own a guitar that worked, didn't own an amp, and I think the Wait guys just liked me as a person, or they were desperate, because they offered me a spot in their band, and they lent me all the gear I needed, and a couple of weeks later, we had a spot opening for the Drive-By Truckers. Now, in the alt-country, country rock world, the Drive-By Truckers are, like Deer Tick, they're a big band. And this show was at a venue in Brooklyn named Warsaw, which is even bigger than Bowery Ballroom, like 1,000 people. So the singer of the Wait lent me his Rickenbacker guitar for the Warsaw show, but he told me I needed to change the strings, which I then waited to do until the day of, which is already not a great idea. You want to wear in the strings a little so they don't go out of tune. So after our sound check, I headed to the Warsaw Green Room, and they had a party sub on a table for our band, a 5-foot sub. And I was broke and starving, and I get hungrier when I'm nervous. So I was cramming this sandwich into my mouth as I took off all of the old guitar strings on the Rickenbacker. Now this was another mistake, because for neck tension reasons, you should only take off a few guitar strings at a time, which I didn't know. But to make matters worse, with a Rickenbacker, the tension of the strings actually holds the guitar together. So after I removed all of the strings, the guitar itself fell into 3 pieces. Now, I wasn't exactly sure how these pieces went back together. There was no internet available to me. I didn't even own a cell phone. And anyway, it was at this point that the rest of the band entered the dressing room. The singer, Joseph, looked at me. I was panicking. He looked at his guitar, which was in pieces on the floor, and then he turned back to me and, with an exhausted tone, said, "Fletcher, I'm pretty sure that if you can't finish that whole sandwich, they'll let you take some of it home after the show." I barely got that guitar together before we went on stage. It would not stay in tune, and basically, my whole performance was a disaster. Anyway, so now back to the present story. It was 3 years later. Deer Tick asked us to play the sold-out show at Bowery Ballroom. I now own my own guitar, which I'd spent years learning how to play, and I even had enough money to buy a sandwich if I needed one. Everything was looking up. We loaded into Bowery, we sound check. I already had fresh strings on the guitar. This was my chance to redeem myself. Now, we had a few hours to kill between sound check and the beginning of the show, so our band went to Chinatown and got some dinner and a few beers. And after that, we walked over to Home Sweet Home, which is a basement bar less than a block from Bowery Ballroom. And we had some more beers and some shots. And then I woke up in my bed. I was blackout drunk when I got offered the show, and I was blackout drunk when I played the show. I have no recollection of being on stage. Now, you might ask, how was my playing? Friends in the audience said it was fine. Once again, they couldn't tell blackout drunk Fletcher from regular drunk Fletcher. But did I redeem myself? I don't know. Strangely, I only have one memory from that night, and I think that memory cut through the alcohol because I was ashamed about it later. And shame is really the most memorable emotion. But in this memory, I was backstage surrounded by my bandmates, and Deer Tick was playing, and I was crying. And I was crying because I was jealous. I was jealous that Deer Tick had made it, and I hadn't. All I had done for most of my adult life was try to be a musician, and I hadn't really gotten anywhere. And I was just jealous. And I was very drunk, so that jealousy was coming out in tears, which my bandmates could see. and I was ashamed of that. And honestly, I'm still jealous today, although I'm a big Deer Tick fan now. But I am still jealous that they could sell out that iconic New York venue, and me, on the other hand, as far as my conscious brain is concerned, I still have never even played at Bowery Ballroom. The first show I ever played with the weight was in the basement of a pizza parlor in Soho, which the owner was trying to convert into some kind of speakeasy situation. Well, after we loaded in, Joseph, the singer of the weight, he found me sitting on a stoop down the block from the pizza place, drinking a 40. And he looked at me and he said, "What are you doing? We get free beer inside." But I knew that this wasn't true. Inside the pizza place, we got beer from a bartender. And while the beers themselves were free, we were still expected to tip $1 for each one. But I didn't have that kind of money at that time in my life. The 40-ounce beer was $2. It was cheaper. But I didn't want to tell Joseph this, because if I did, he would probably have offered to buy me beers inside the show. And I hate when people buy me things. I just wanted to take care of myself the best way I knew how, which in this case was drinking on the street. So I turned to Joseph and said, "Oh, we get free beer inside? I didn't know that." And Joseph left, and I sat on that stoop and slowly finished the rest of my 40. I am not a religious or spiritual person. If anything, I think that science is magical and scientific understanding is godlike. But basically, I'm about as atheist as you can get. Or I guess agnostic, because I will admit that I myself don't know anything for sure. But in spite of me having this mentality, there is one thing that happened to my family that showed me a strange connection between humans that has no current scientific reasoning. Although I honestly believe science will one day be able to tell us exactly why this happened. Although at this moment, this whole story just seems like magic. And maybe it is. So my brother and I grew up skateboarding and snowboarding. And these were activities that we invested a ton of time in and we were pretty good at. Now, while I was always a little death aversive, which doesn't help you excel at these particular hobbies, my little brother was an absolute maniac. Matt would jump down anything, off anything, or through anything. One time a kid from our school shot a skate video of all of our friends, and we each had our own part, or we each had our own section of the video just for our best tricks. And when it got to my brother's part, it basically looked like a classic skate video crash section. Every shot was of Matt ollieing down large staircases and destroying himself. I don't know if he landed a single trick. My brother just wanted his part of the video to be him launching huge gaps and seeing what happened, because that is how he lived. Anyway, so this story takes place after I had moved to Boston, during the 1 year that my little brother lived at home without me. It was a Saturday in the winter, and like most winter weekends, my brother had gone snowboarding. The ski mountain near our house was an early adopter of snowboard parks, which are particular trails that are set aside to have jumps constructed on them. And my brother was notorious for hitting these jumps so fast that he'd sail well past the intended landing, and instead he'd come crashing down on like the unforgiving, often icy flat ground below. Just the flat ground after the jump. One time when I was still living in Vermont, I was snowboarding with my brother, and like usual, he cleared one of those jumps, and he hit his head so hard that he spent the next hour with like reoccurring amnesia, where every minute he would forget everything that happened between the crash and that moment. He had like goldfish brain. So we'd explain to him where he was and what was happening, and the moment he understood what we were talking about, he would then forget everything again, and we'd have to start explaining from scratch. Terrifying. But anyway, okay. So on the Saturday where this story takes place, I had moved away, so my brother was snowboarding on his own, and my mom was spending the day hanging out at her friend's house. The way she tells it, my mom had gone to her friend's house to confess to her friend all of the wrongs my mom had made in her life. And while she was in the middle of this, my mom heard an ambulance's siren off in the distance. Now, in spite of my little brother having this death wish, my mom was not an overly worried person. My brother and I never had a curfew. From a very young age, we were allowed to go off in the woods and play by ourselves. My mom certainly cared about our well-being and wasn't neglectful in any way. But she's not someone that anyone who knows her would characterize as a worrier. And that's what makes this next part so interesting. After my mom heard the ambulance's siren, she had this uncharacteristic sensation of dread in her stomach. My mom tried to go on with her conversation, but this horrible feeling haunted her until she finally stopped and asked to use her friend's phone. This was the 90s, before cell phones, but my mom was able to call our house and listen to the messages on our answering machine. At this time, my mom was a newspaper reporter, and she had retrieved messages in this way in the past when she was working on a story, but she had never in her life, not once, called home because she felt like something generally in the world was wrong. But she heard that ambulance, she had a feeling, she called home, and she found a message from the ski resort saying that my brother had been found unconscious on the mountain and was now in an ambulance being rushed to the nearest hospital. Mind you, based on my mom's location, the ambulance my mom heard was almost certainly not the one that my brother was in. But still, in that moment, there was some kind of information shared across the universe between a mother and her unconscious son. And my mom ran out of her friend's house, jumped in her car, and sped off toward the hospital. I've had ringing in my ears for most of my adult life, which I guess makes sense when you look at exactly how I've lived. I spent almost every night of my 20s at a concert, or a bar, or a club, or band practice, and often 2 or 3 of these things in one night. Also, I've worked as a bartender for 18 years, and half of that job is just having customers scream their drink order in your face. And I'm sad to say that I've rarely used earplugs, so I basically allowed this to happen. The ringing definitely bothers me when I think about it. I have ringing in both ears, and while they're about the same volume, they are unfortunately not playing the same note. Maybe the worst part of the whole thing is that the continuous high-pitched note ringing in my left ear clashes with the continuous high-pitched note ringing in my right ear. When you play them together, it's dissonant. They're like fighting each other. Basically, it's not a song you'd want to hear every minute of every day for the rest of your life. But that's how it is, because there is no cure for ringing in your ears, which is also named tinnitus. I notice it most when I go home to visit my parents because they live in the middle of nowhere, Vermont, and there's no other sounds to distract me from the ringing. But, luckily, I live in New York City, the loudest place on earth. So the whole tinnitus thing, it's just drowned out by the sound of music and honking and people talking and people living everywhere. I don't notice it that much. But there was a period of time when this was not the case. I was addicted to Xanax for 5 years, from 2011 to 16. And this wasn't that big of a deal for me. I equate it to being addicted to cigarettes. I took Xanax 4 times a day, every day, and after I took it, I felt normal, and as the effects faded, I felt anxious, and then I'd take it again, and I'd feel normal. It didn't make me feel fucked up or euphoric or anything. I just felt normal when I took it. But then, it turns out that if you take Xanax 4 times a day, every day for 5 years, much like cigarettes, you will get really fucking addicted to it. Who knew? I genuinely did not. I had the worst fucking doctor at the time, and he never told me. In fact, when I told him that I thought I was addicted to Xanax and wanted to get off, his response was to recommend that I raise my dose. But anyway, I didn't listen to that psycho. I halved my dosage periodically for about a year, which was a fucking nightmare, and I finally got off of it. But when that was done, for some reason, the ringing in my ears increased tenfold. I don't know if tenfold is the right amount, but it increased a lot. Suddenly there was no escaping it. I could now hear the tinnitus over music or like over my window unit air conditioner, and basically everything I might want to use to drown out the ringing so I could fall asleep or whatever. That wasn't working. And I'm having Xanax withdrawals, and basically I don't know what the fuck is going on. And I'm scared, and it's so loud, and I'm really going, I can't live like this. So I go to a doctor, and he says what everyone says, that there's nothing science knows how to do to reduce tinnitus. And he doesn't know why the ringing would have suddenly increased, but he gives me an antibiotic ear drop just to try, and for whatever reason, I have a negative reaction to that ear drop that it makes my ear canal close. So now no outside sound is getting in, so the ringing is even louder. Anyway, I stop with the ear drop, obviously, and I start with the worst thing I can possibly do, which is, of course, trying to diagnose myself by using the internet. Does Xanax cause tinnitus? Yes. You can find a whole forum of people on the internet who say that Xanax causes ringing in your ears. Does Xanax stop tinnitus? Yes. There's a whole other group who agree that Xanax is the cure for the ringing. But I also looked up, do my hair loss pills cause tinnitus? And you know what? The internet says they absolutely do. A lot of people have had Propecia cause permanent ringing in their ears. But what about Advil? Listeners, you're not going to believe this. It does. The internet says it's the cause of tinnitus. Anyway, spoiler alert, they were all wrong. Don't diagnose yourself using the internet. But for whatever reason, the result that I got caught up on was the idea that Xanax cured tinnitus. I became convinced that while I was addicted to Xanax, the ringing had been dulled. The Xanax had lessened the ringing. And now that I was off Xanax, the ringing I was now hearing, the loud ringing, it was the real ringing, which meant that it was permanent, never going away. And this idea, I just cried myself to sleep so many nights during this period. So during this time, the ringing was much worse in my right ear. And there was a period of time when I thought, maybe a doctor could just make me deaf in my right ear to stop the ringing. Like, that would be a good possible solution, which is insane. But the tinnitus was making me that sad and that insane. So around 2 months go by like this. And one night I'm working at the bar and my coworker asked me if I have any Xanax, because I always did in the past. And I go, no, man, I'm off that stuff. And you got to watch out because that shit is addictive. And he's like, yeah, I know. I don't know why I was the only one who didn't know this. But then I said, that's not even the worst part. The Xanax gave me crazy ringing in my ears. It's driving me insane. And my coworker tells me, oh yeah, when I was going through Xanax withdrawals, I had really bad tinnitus. And this was the first time that it occurred to me that maybe the Xanax didn't help or hurt my ears. Maybe it was the withdrawals themselves that were causing the ringing, and that when the withdrawals passed, the intense ringing would subside. And I don't know, but in that moment, standing behind the bar, looking at another man who had experienced Xanax addiction, I decided I would believe this. Because this idea was the first one that came with hope. Now, determining how much the ringing has decreased as the withdrawals decreased is a little confusing because, I had ringing before I ever took Xanax, and I still have ringing now. And the lessening of the tinnitus was not like a fever breaking or anything. It happened so slowly that I really didn't know it was happening at all. I just know that if I lay in bed now, I'm not crying myself to sleep because of the incredible noise in my head. But that took, who knows how long that took. The only thing that happened quickly was the hope. The hope the other bartender gave me that it might go away. On a side note, I have heard that people with tinnitus can use noise-canceling headphones to experience what it's like to not have the ringing. And this might not surprise you, but you can also find many people on the internet saying that noise-canceling headphones themselves actually cause people to have tinnitus. In either case, I've decided never to try these headphones, mainly because I worry that if I experience the world without the ringing in my ears, even for a moment, it might just make me too fucking sad to have to go back to the ringing I'm stuck listening to for the rest of my life. That's episode 4. Thanks for listening. If you know someone who's ever shoved their hand deeply down another person's throat, please tell them about this episode. If you know someone named Barb, please let them know about my podcast. Nothing helps me more than you listeners telling your friends to check out my stories. In this day and age, word of mouth is the best way to get people to try something new. And anyone you tell is much appreciated. This was another conversational episode, like last week's, or the Williamsburg episodes from Season 3, or the fashion episode from Season 2. I really have 2 types of episodes. The literary episodes, like Couchsurfing or Bicycles, which they're really meant to be read on the page. They're meant to live in a book. And I just try to read them here like someone reading an audiobook. I try to do that well. And then you have the conversational episodes, which are written specifically for me to read out loud. The conversational episodes are basically an entire episode of me writing dialogue. The way I write conversationally isn't any different than the way I write the dialogue for the characters in the literary stories. Sometimes I write a section for a conversational episode, and it accidentally becomes a beautiful piece of literature. And then I read it back out loud, and it doesn't sound like someone naturally talking, so then I have to delete it and come up with a more basic conversational way of saying the same thing. Everyone seems to like the conversational episodes, so I'm trying to include 1 or 2 per season. But writing literature is really my main interest, so that's how I do most of the stories. In this season, you can hear something interesting. I have the bicycle episode, which is 8 short stories written in the literary style. And then I have this episode, which is 8 short stories written in the conversational style. So you can really compare if you're paying attention. I'm giving you the full spectrum. If you want to see some of my writing in a book, well, you're in luck. I'm asking people to support this season of the podcast by sending me $5 through Venmo. $5 for the 5 episodes. But if you send me $20 or more, I will mail you a little book of my writing, and you can check it out on the page. If you didn't get the book I released for season 3, just send me $40. I'll send you both books. Get off your phones. Read something on a page. You'll sleep better. But that being said, if you can only afford $5, that's okay. Really, anything helps. $5 is very appreciated. My Venmo is at Fletcher C. Johnson, and my PayPal is fletchercjohnson@gmail.com. Next week, for the final episode of Season 4, we're getting out of our familiar setting and we're taking the stories down to Atlanta, Georgia. Now you can see how the garage rock scene survived the crime wave of 2009. Until then, you've been listening to Fletcher C. Johnson. I'm Fletcher C. Johnson. Thanks for listening.